Hello and welcome to 1,000 Natural Shocks, About with Money podcast. I'm your host, Gabe Dunn. And with me today, we have Prit Buttar, who is the author of a book called Into the Reich. And this episode is, I would say, educational. The book is about the Red Army, which is the Soviet Army's offensive against Nazi Germany, and all of it starting with an attempt on Adolf Hitler's life. Longtime listeners know that I am descended from Holocaust survivors, and my grandmother, whose voice I played on the show a long time ago, May, was in a concentration camp for girls when she was around 14 years old. We lost a lot of family members in the Holocaust, and World War II has been a big, both looming taboo subject in my family and also something that I don't go a day without thinking about, basically. My grandmother had passed away, and yeah, it's just, she just would never want to talk about anything around it. I had to really push to get some information out of her towards the end of her life. But Prit's book actually, follows her life through Poland and Paris pretty exactly as the Soviet army closes in and pushes in from the east as the Allies push in from the west. Why do I want to talk about this on this podcast? I was interested in the ways in which the playbook for Nazi Germany came from the United States and the ways in which the Native American population was genocided here. Often we think of the U.S. copying Nazi Germany, but we are the blueprint for how we treated Native Americans. And honestly, they looked at aspects of slavery as well. As I suspected, a lot of this interview could literally just be about what's going on in the United States today. Prit's in the UK. Prit is British Indian, so he has that perspective of immigration and the ways in which the UK has its own problems with racism and xenophobia. The leadership in World War II was entirely focused on evading accountability and shifting blames onto others. There's this psychological effect of wanting to be quote-unquote clean, wanting to be the people that were not in charge of these atrocities, that only the concentration camp guards were the ones involved in cruelty and inhumane treatment of not just Jews, but Roma, of disabled people, of queer people. And so all the way down the line, the subordinates were blamed. Down to the army, which was obviously suffering from not just morale problems, but a lack of resources. Hitler's leadership style towards the end was inflexible holding on to a last gasp of his authoritarian regime. There's so many ways that all of this could have gone, and I get into a lot of that with Prit, and it's just a really fascinating episode. I'm particularly interested in the ways that history continues to repeat itself and what we could possibly learn from our circumstances not being as unique as we worry they are. So please enjoy, weird way to put it, this episode with Prit Buttar.
Told a lot of lies about achievement. They called you when they got you to believe it. Thumb and finger held to their foreheads in an L shape, trapped in a capitalist hellscape. Let's fight back and have some talks about class and the massive cost of the disasters, plots of fascists and Nazis, fat cats and fogs. It's 1,000 Natural Shocks, a Bad with Money podcast.
Hello and welcome to 1,000 Natural Shocks, a Bad with Money podcast. I'm your host, Gabe Dunn, and today we have Prit Buttar, who I have a lot of questions for. Do you want to tell my audience who you are and what you do?
So I was a family doctor before I started writing. The two careers overlapped for a while. I've now hung up the stethoscope and I just write. I've written several books. I think the total is 16 on the Eastern Front in both World Wars. And I'm now at the start of a new cycle of writing, which I am absolutely loving because I am co-authoring this with my daughter, who is a proper historian. She did history at Cambridge and has a double first and is terrifyingly clever. So I have to raise my game accordingly.
Oh, wow. Was she inspired by you?
Oh, good heavens, no, no, she was no, she's far too smart for that. Quite the opposite, really. In fact, she's been the one who has encouraged me and pushed me along the way and kept me motivated, etc. So now we are writing a series of books that my editor has commissioned from us. The overall title is, if you like, Cities at War. We have just finished the manuscript for an account of Warsaw during the war, and
Wow.
we are now at the start of a project about Paris during the Second World War.
Wow.
And looking ahead, gosh, the list of cities that we want to explore on this, you can imagine, it just goes on and on.
You seem to be following my grandmother.
Oh, really?
She was in Warsaw and then in Paris, but she was in a concentration camp in between. So I'm Jewish. So a lot of them perished that way.
Gosh, yeah.
And then she came to the US in 1947. She married a soldier. She married an American soldier
Yeah.
and then came over here.
It is a constant reminder to me. One of my books was about the Lithuanian Holocaust, and I've had more contacts about that book, probably personal contacts, than I've had in many, many other books.
Wow.
So many people saying, this is personal for me because you're describing what happened to members of my extended family. And I
Uh-huh.
think for me, it is just this constant reminder that what to people like me is history. It may well be hideously unpleasant history, but it is nonetheless history. For other people is very much their living past. And I think it's an important thing to keep that in mind, both when you're reading and when you're writing.
When did you start this book? It's like so much research. I'm wondering when this book started.
It's an interesting question because you can imagine writing about the same theatre. I end up using the same source material in different nuances and different ways. So the research is almost ongoing on a continuous basis. It isn't as if I start with, okay, we're going to do Warsaw over the next 3 years, so let's get a reading list and then we'll analyze that and start writing up notes. It's more a matter of it's always ongoing. And even when I'm reading a book, I'm keeping a file on my MacBook about the things that I just find interesting in it, which may or may not then provide seed material for future books. It's a very hard question to answer. I suspect I may be a bit of an outlier in the way historians work, but for me, this is very much the sort of stuff I read about all the time. So the research is continuous. And when I look at, for example, the Paris book, I've even dug out some books which I had put up in the loft. I hadn't read them for about 15 years, but I remembered that actually there was something useful in there about the phony war and about Paris and the run up to the German arrival, etc. So yeah, it's a tricky question to answer.
And we'll get into some more about that in a second, but it starts with an assassination attempt, and I could not help but draw parallels. And I was wondering, because I'm in the United States,
Yes.
and so I'm familiar with World War II from a personal perspective. I don't know a lot about the minutia and how things went down and where. So when I was looking at the book, I was like, oh, this is kind of, I knew it's what was happening now, but it's it's almost a little bit of a one-to-one. So can you talk a little bit about what happened with the assassination attempt on Hitler and then what subsequently rose from that?
This is a remarkably controversial subject because so few of the conspirators survived. There was a massive purge. Many of them were arrested and executed very quickly. Others were subjected to terrible torture and killed. Still others were just imprisoned on suspicion, and many of those died as the SS, if you like, cleaned house right before the final surrender. The survivors of the conspiracy have tended to write accounts which, for lack of any corroboration or contradiction, we've largely had to accept as well, okay, these are the only guys left standing, so if they say this happened, then who are we to say otherwise? As time has gone by and people have become a little bit more, perhaps, I'm struggling to think of a better word, but more sophisticated in the way they approach memoirs, etc., you start to throw more doubt on it. I think the starting point is that there was no single anti-Hitler conspiracy. There were loads of them. There were plenty of Germans who were very strongly anti-Hitler, and many were prepared to, take the ultimate risk in order to do something about it. But overall, these people remained in a very small minority within Germany as a whole. Of those people, a very, very few would be people that you or I might identify as these are people that we really, really want to have in charge of Germany, because these people are liberal Democrats and they're going to support a proper, meaningful, accountable government. Most of them were authoritarian. People like Stauffenberg, played by Tom Cruise in the movie Valkyrie, he was, unashamedly an authoritarian. He wanted a military regime running Germany. And the final plot that then went bad in the July plot of 1944, their intention was not to get into power so they could surrender. It was to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. They fully intended to hold on to all the territory they had seized in Poland, and they wanted a free hand to fight the Soviet Union. So even had they succeeded in killing Hitler, it's highly unlikely that Roosevelt would have agreed to, do business with these people. Churchill, I'm not so sure. I have doubts about that. But I suspect in the end the Western powers would not have agreed to deal with these people. And in the end, because they were in a minority, the result would have been that even with Hitler dead, there would probably have been huge infighting within Germany. Himmler arguably perhaps knew that a plot was coming. He may not have known the precise details, but the speed with which he rounded up every conceivable suspect is suspicious. There was no time really for lengthy investigations. These people were snapped up very, very quickly, which suggests that their identities were at least known. And, Himmler would have been perfectly positioned to say, what a terrible disaster for Germany that the Führer is dead, but how fortunate that I have the SS and all the security apparatus and I can just step in and take power. I think there would have been multiple players who would have tried to do that. The result would have been that it's very difficult to fight a war on two fronts, or indeed on a single front, when you're too busy trying to fight rivals for control within your own country. And I think the consequence of that would have been a fairly chaotic collapse of Germany, which, because so many of the people who died in the Second World War died in the last 12 months, might have resulted in a considerably smaller death toll in the war as a whole. But I think it's worth remembering that one of the bad legacies of the First World War was the stab in the back legend, where German politicians and German civilians grew up in the years after the war believing that the German army hadn't been defeated. It was those terrible, cowardly politicians and the home front that collapsed. And you can imagine the fertile ground there would have been for an even greater stab in the back legend had Germany collapsed in response to a failed assassination attempt. But having said that, it has to be said that whilst in the end, I suspect Stauffenberg and his fellow plotters were doomed to failure, it was the last moment where Germany might have avoided the utter catastrophe that was then to unfold over the remaining months of the war.
How did they try to kill him?
So they tried to kill him with a bomb. They had decided that a bomb was the way to go, and Stauffenberg had already taken a briefcase bomb to Hitler's headquarters in Bavaria. But had aborted the attack because only Hitler was present and none of the other senior figures were present. So we then end up with the 20th of July, where there is this conference in Rastenburg in East Prussia, where Stauffenberg turns up with a bomb in a briefcase. In fact, it's two bombs in a briefcase. Before going into the conference, he arms the bombs. He himself had been badly injured in a British air attack in North Africa. He had lost, I think, most of one hand and some of the fingers of the other hand. He was blind in one eye. And he struggled in the tension of the moment to arm both bombs. He only armed one of the bombs. He took the other one out of the bag, gave it to his aide and said, we'll throw that away when we leave. They put it under the table where the conference was going to be, and he had arranged for somebody to phone him asking for him to come to the phone, so he had an excuse to leave the conference room. Having left the room, he then left Rastenburg. He heard an explosion behind him, managed to bluff his way out of the base. Unknown to him, one of the other people at the conference had sat down at the table and had banged his knee on the briefcase and had complained, who's the idiot who left this briefcase here, and had moved it behind a large table leg so that it was now shielded from the direct path to Hitler. Moreover, the conference was usually held in a concrete bunker, but because it was midsummer and because the bunker conference room was actually being repainted, it was taking place in a wooden hut in outside. So if both bombs had been present, if the bomb hadn't been moved, if the conference had been in a concrete box which would have contained the blast and therefore, done much more damage to everybody within that confined space, if any of those three had been true, the plot would have succeeded. But because it was behind this table leg, there were multiple injuries. Hitler suffered a perforated eardrum and multiple leg lacerations. One person died. Many, many others were injured. But crucially, the Führer survived. And thereafter, the plot unraveled very, very rapidly.
It's interesting. Was there any talk of he did this himself so that he could garner sympathy and power?
No. This was very much a plot by a group within the high command. One of the plotters, Hans Gisevius, was one of the very, very few to survive. He wrote a memoir of all of the plots against Hitler entitled To the Bitter End, which makes fascinating reading, though, like I say, you have to read this with a degree of skepticism. He's talking about events where he is the only survivor, so we don't necessarily know how accurate it is. But it's quite clear that there were many, many people within the civil service, within the military, who had really had enough, and they felt the only way out was to kill Hitler. So this was a genuine plot. And, they say the devil looks after his own, and certainly, Hitler was extraordinarily lucky to get away. There had been a similar plot a couple of years, in early 1943, where a bomb was put on a plane that was carrying him back from the Eastern Front back to Germany. The bomb was in a package which was meant to contain 2 bottles of alcohol as a present for somebody in Berlin. One of the officers on the Eastern Front had asked one of his friends to take it back on Hitler's plane. And for reasons of space, really, this person had placed this package in the cargo hold of Hitler's plane rather than in the cabin, and it was too cold. It was too cold for the fuses to set off the explosives. So, it wasn't the only time that Hitler survived by an extraordinary turn of fate. This was not contrived. This was just one of these crazy moments where you just sort of scratch your head and think it was harder for things to turn out that way than for him to end up dead. And yet that's what happened.
Can you explain the terms that Germany wanted from the Allies? It seems like, one, I wrote Hitler was extremely bad at the military. So can you talk about what they wanted from the Allies, what they wanted the end result to be?
Okay, so Germany, as in Hitler's Germany, wanted to be the dominant power in Europe. Any other nations that were not directly under German control would be quite constrained in what they could do without German approval. He saw a large German land empire running from some of the occupied parts of eastern Belgium and eastern France, running across what is now Germany, all the way across Poland into what was then the Soviet Union, and actually extending down to Crimea. Crimea was going to become a gigantic holiday resort for the German Empire.
Oh my God.
A lot of this was born out of the experiences of the First World War, where ultimately Germany was strangled by the naval blockade that starved Germany into defeat. And the intention was that if we control a land empire that encompasses most of the fertile regions of Ukraine, we will never fear a naval blockade again. We will be absolutely untouchable. So that was the logic behind it, if you like. But Hitler was also very much driven by his own vision of empire. In this respect, he was actually inheriting a very different colonial mindset than had been the case, for example, in the British Empire and the French Empire. Hitler made a point of, the British Empire is ultimately doomed. Look how few white British people there are holding down India. You can't do this. In the end, you have to replace the native population with your own people, and that is the way you build a lasting empire. And he used North America as a model for this. He frequently said to those around him, just remember what happened to, he used the expression American Indians. Today we'd say Native Americans. Just remember what happened to them over the last century. Who even remembers them now? So his vision of what was going to happen in Eastern Europe was to open up these territories. The Jews were going to be the first to go, along with the Roma people, with the disabled, with various other groups that he had earmarked as, if you like, the first in the queue for destruction. But the Slavic populations were not far behind them, and ultimately their only place would have been to provide a slave class for the Germans who would then come as settlers. And his vision was that over 150 years, we will transform Eastern Europe much as white settlers have transformed North America. And we will replace the indigenous populations with our own people, and we will then have this German empire that lasts a very long time. One of the things that comes out of the Second World War, incidentally, is this talk of, Hitler talked about building the 1,000-year Reich. This was going to be an empire that would last 1,000 years. Some of your listeners might be interested to know that the origins of the 1,000-year Reich go back over 1,000 years. They go back to the early days of the Holy Roman Empire and the era immediately after Charlemagne, where it was believed that once Christ's kingdom was established on earth, there would be a reign of 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. So the Nazis took that and twisted it into their own ideology. But because it was something that was, if you like, culturally already part of the thinking of so many Germans, you can see how it was relatively straightforward for them to lift that and steal it and distort it to suit their own ends. But the basis of that 1,000-year Reich was going to be the mass extermination of all of the races that he objected to.
Yeah, I've seen a lot recently about we didn't steal from Hitler. Hitler stole from us being the United States or North America, which has been eye-opening.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? No nation likes to think of itself as the bad guys. We all like to have a very positive picture of ourselves. I have a very good friend in St. Petersburg, and we chat online, every 2, 3, 4 weeks. And although he is absolutely against Putin or whatever, he struggles with the whole concept of I am a nation that is actually a pariah and that we are on the wrong side of a war. He's a Russian. For him, this is something that he really wrestles with, and we all do that. But as I've often said to people, when I've done battlefield tours in the Baltic states, we often end up at the National Memorial in Tallinn, and I often talk about how the use of memorials and architecture is, if you like, propaganda, and how any nation's official history is almost always selective. You tell the bits you want to tell and you don't tell the other bits. So, for example, in the Estonian memorial, there are memorial stones to the Estonian regiments that fought against the Red Army when the Soviets returned there in 1944. What's missing from those memorial stones? 2 letters, SS. Those were SS regiments. But you remember them because they were freedom fighters, not because actually many of them were war criminals. And I always finish that talk at that memorial by saying to people, whenever you read the history of your own nation, whichever country you're from, if there are not moments where it makes you feel deeply uncomfortable, what you're reading is probably not history.
Yeah, I think that it's been interesting to see what is going on in the US, because you say Germans, right? And Hitler, the rumor, or the whatever is, they say, oh, he was very popular. And you say the German people. It seems like they were really on board until the military started going super downhill.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. The early victories over Poland, Belgium, Holland, France, Denmark, Norway, etc., they were greeted with a degree of enthusiasm, but it was nuanced. So, for example, when one of the divisions involved in the Battle of France returned to Berlin, the general mood was not so much celebrating the great victory over the old enemy France. It was a mixture of relief that their sons and brothers and husbands had come home alive. It was particular pleasure that they came home laden with loot that they had taken from France, which, let's face it, if you're going to loot a country, France is probably not a bad place to loot.
Yeah.
It wasn't really enthusiasm for establishing German control over France. Having said that, Berlin, despite being the capital, was probably one of the least pro-Nazi cities of the entire Reich. So you have to again draw nuances to this. That different cities reacted in different ways, different people reacted in different ways. But you're right. Generally, while you have a leader in a nation and things are going well, there's usually either very little opposition, or those who are opposed don't get heard, or just learn to sit back and say, well, let's wait and see how this goes. It's only when things start to unravel and go badly wrong that the mood changes. So, for example, over here in Britain, we have gone through some interesting times politically, with leaving the European Union, with electing Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. And at the time, he was an extraordinarily popular person, even though many felt it was utter madness to trust a known liar and charlatan with such power.
Oh my
Yet
God.
when it started going wrong, you would struggle to find anybody who would admit to having been a supporter of him. And yet the facts speak for themselves. Somebody voted for him. Somebody voted him into power. And the same goes with Nazi Germany. It's worth remembering that Hitler becomes chancellor as a result of an election. And yes, it was a very violent election. There was a lot of intimidation and, violence on the streets in the run-up to the election and during the election. But nonetheless, the Germans voted in the Nazi Party. So much as, it's a little bit like when you look at the history of France, you will get this tension between, were people in Paris and other places collaborating with the Germans? Were they in the resistance? Or were they just simply surviving and just trying to get by? And depending on which way you nuance that history, people have painted very convincing versions of history that reflect all three of those. And the truth is that history is very messy. All three of those are true.
I was interested in the aspect of revenge having to do with this, with the Red Army. Well, first, can you explain the Red Army, and then can you explain what the revenge aspect was?
Absolutely. 20 million plus Soviet citizens died in the Second World War. Somewhere around about 50, 60%, 70, 65% maybe of those were military. The rest were civilians. That's a huge number of civilians. If you look at Leningrad, what is now St. Petersburg, more Soviet citizens died in and around Leningrad. So within the city, defending the city, trying to lift the siege of the city. More Soviet citizens died during the siege of Leningrad than British Empire war dead of both world wars put together.
Wow.
And that is one city. So
Wow.
this is a nation that had suffered absolutely horrific casualties. And there's an American historian who teaches Holocaust studies in the north of England, Waitman Bjorn, who has written some excellent books, not exactly cheerful reading, but they are very powerful books on the Holocaust. And in one of his books, he puts it very neatly. He says that The Holocaust in the western parts of the Soviet Union did not take place because the Germans invaded and occupied that area. It was the other way around. They invaded that territory in order to carry out mass murder. And as we've already touched on, Hitler's idea of a European empire was based on eliminating existing populations and replacing them with German settlers. This led to something called the Hunger Plan, where it was deliberately calculated how many Soviet people were going to have to die to create the agricultural surpluses that the Nazis wanted. And during their plans for the invasion, as their desire for tonnage of grain increased, they just simply ramped up the numbers. So by the time the invasion starts, they were talking quite confidently and with sort of surprisingly callous indifference, if you like, that, well, we're talking about between 20 and 30 million people are going to have to die within just a few years. And then the rest of the population, they'll eventually die, but that's the priority, to get over that first number of dead. So wherever the Germans went on the Eastern Front, there was mass killing. And of course, attention is often focused on the Jewish populations, but they were by no means alone. Many millions of Ukrainians who had already suffered starvation under Stalin were then subjected to further starvation as the Germans seized huge amounts of grain and other agricultural produce and shipped it off back to Germany and elsewhere. The result was that the Soviets were basically fighting for their very existence. And whilst the Red Army was a very, by Western standards, it was a very clumsy instrument. It wasn't, if you like, a cutting-edged sword. It was more of a bludgeon with which you beat your opponent into submission. But nevertheless, that was all they had, and they had to learn how to use that bludgeon more efficiently in the most impossible circumstances, in the middle of a fight for their very existence. And they did so, and they did so by fairly narrow margins in some respects. But by the time they start moving forward, most Soviet soldiers either have family who have been involved in the massacres carried out by the Germans, or else they know other people who have family. Regiments and divisions kept revenge books in which soldiers were encouraged to write about family members who had suffered under German occupation. And these would then be read out by political commissars at political meetings in order to motivate the soldiers to keep fighting. Because, battle fatigue was setting in the Red Army. People were just saying, how many times can I go over the top and survive? Sooner or later, there's a bullet with my name on it. So one of the ways of keeping people motivated was to give soldiers an enormous thirst for revenge. As they approached German territory, Polish territory, this became overlaid with a degree of encouragement towards sexual violence, some of which was deliberate, some of it happened anyway because that's what armies do, and the political officers then purely amplified what was already happening. It served many ends. First of all, it creates terror. If you become known as an army where you take few prisoners, where women and children are going to suffer, particularly the women, at the hands of your invaders, it tends to destroy morale. And one of Stalin's motivations was, if we're going to redraw the maps of Europe and parts of Eastern Germany are going to be handed over to Poland, while I seize chunks of Poland for the Soviet Union, it helps if we get rid of the German populations first. So the whole process of ethnic cleansing becomes easier if half the population has already fled in terror before your soldiers arrive there. But as people have found in pretty much every war, trying to demoralize a population through terror is a two-edged weapon. I mean, on the one hand, yes, it did cause absolute terror in the civilian population and huge columns of refugees streaming west. On the other hand, it also gives people a very strong motivation to keep on fighting.
Yeah.
Because you're the last barrier between your people suffering like this So you're going to, even if you think you're going to lose, you're still going to keep on fighting in the hope that a few more families might be able to slip away further west, where however terrible the British and French and Americans might be, they're not going to be as bad as the Soviets.
Wow. This is so fascinating. God, everything is the same always. I have a friend and she's brilliant. We were talking about the phrase, those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. And I was like, here's the thing. Even if they do learn history, they either use it as a blueprint or to like do the bad thing, or they just go, well, that's not right now. People are going to repeat it no matter what.
Exactly. And part of it is that you can interpret history pretty much however you wish. So, for example, if we think about what we've just talked about, the brutality of the Red Army's arrival in East Prussia and eastern parts of Germany, yes, it was a horrific series of war crimes. But if you're of the mindset that ultimately peace is secured by creating an ethnically homogeneous population, you can say, okay, this may be terrible, but in the long term, maybe this reduces the overall casualties. Now, I'm not, I hasten to say I am not advocating that, but all I'm saying is it's how somebody could choose to interpret history in order
Right.
to, what people don't look at history and say, so what are the lessons to learn here? It's quite the other way around. People start with a fixed set of beliefs and prejudices, and then they scratch around in history looking for the bits of history that support their views, whilst looking for reasons to ignore the bits that don't support their views. And that's kind of fundamental to the terrible, terrible creatures that human beings are.
I believe that. People probably fight you on humans being terrible.
Well, I spent most of my working life as a doctor, and I saw some pretty horrible things. And I'm left, medicine is one of these curious fields where it doesn't leave much room for agnosticism. I know plenty of doctors who are devout believers in their own gods. I know plenty of doctors who are devout atheists. I know very, very few who are anywhere in the middle. It tends to polarize you because of the things that you see and that you experience, and the suffering that you see and you experience. And particularly when that suffering has been caused by other human beings, it is, you know, all the more painful and difficult to assimilate and difficult to rationalize sometimes.
Yeah, it's like stepping out of the matrix maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think I've been involved in activism for a short amount of time, but I always, I mean, this is terrible, maybe, but I always, in what I've seen with regards to the treatment of people that have become the people of du jour, of attacking, killing, etc. I always think about the Anne Frank quote where she's like, "Despite everything, I still believe people are good at heart." And I am like, she was wrong. They killed her. Like,
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. So in Britain over the last 3, 4, 5 years, there has been this rising tide of anti-immigrant sentiment,
I know.
which has resulted in quite a lot of violence, a lot of very unpleasant protests, a lot of intimidation of people, whether they are people like me who arrived in Britain in 1961, or whether they're recent arrivals. It's not a pleasant environment. And yes, I absolutely recognize that the perpetrators of a lot of this are a minority. But, it's not just the minority who commit such acts. It's the majority who choose to look the other way, or
Yeah.
who try to minimize, pretend that it isn't as big as it is. So collusion through silence becomes a big factor in promoting these things. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about prejudice against people of a different skin color or a different religion or a different sexuality, or against women in the workplace, whatever we're talking about.
Uh-huh.
It's not sometimes to me what's particularly shocking and offensive isn't the fact that there are some horrible people who will do these things. It's the fact that there are so many who will simply look the other way.
Yeah, I agree. I could go on and on. So I mentioned earlier that Hitler was pretty bad at military stuff. Do you think it was like a death rattle that he was like, I'm inflexible about what we're doing with the German military?
It's a very interesting thing. There are to an extent, the answer to that depends on precisely which time slice you're looking at, because
Mm,
he evolves during the war as does everybody else. But there are several aspects to that. Firstly, it's always worth remembering that although many of the Germans in the years of victory regarded him as this guy who had been inspirational in his leadership, in his innovative
mm,
embracing of you know, different strategies from the traditional ones. Brauchitsch, the last supreme commander of the German army before Hitler took that post on himself, he described Hitler as the greatest field officer of all time, which is kind of a stretch for a man whose military career in the First World War reached the dizzying rank of corporal. So Hitler had no personal professional experience, even as a junior officer, let alone commanding armies, army groups, etc.
uh-huh.
He had the ability sometimes, like many people who come into a subject from the outside, he could often make connections that those within that framework were, if you like, too bound by convention to see. So he was the man who embraced Manstein's plan for an advance through the Ardennes in 1940 in the West, and he was an enthusiast for panzer divisions when the more traditionally minded officers were saying, I'm not really sure about this newfangled idea. Maybe we should just stick to traditional formations. So
Uh-huh.
that was where the, if you like, the victory years come in. The problem with being a sort of amateur dabbler is it's very impressive when you start dabbling as an amateur and it goes really well. But
Uh-huh.
when
Uh-huh.
things go wrong, you then lack the professional training to fall back on how you get yourself out of those difficulties.
Uh-huh.
And it was like, well, what can I say? There are many political leaders in countries all over the world who you could look at in this way, who rise to that position, not least because they are unwilling or absolutely unable ever to accept that it's their fault. There's always somebody else's fault. So when
Uh-huh.
things start to go wrong in the Second World War, Hitler increasingly blames his generals. It's their fault for not following his instructions. And the recurring theme is they don't show the required level of fanaticism and this sort of mystical will to win. I mean, of course, wanting to win is important, whether we're talking about a sports event or whether we're
Uh-huh.
talking about a military conflict. But in the end, it's no substitute for firepower and for weight of artillery and logistic supply and everything else. And yet,
Right.
Hitler, it became, yeah, if they believe enough, we can still win, even in the face of, facing the industrial might of the United States and the British Empire, etc., where, frankly, there was no way that German industry was ever going to be able to compete on that sort of scale. Um,
Uh-huh.
so he becomes trapped within this mindset of, I was winning so long as people were doing what I was telling them to do,
Uh-huh.
and we are losing because they are no longer doing what I tell them to do. Therefore, it must be their fault. As
Uh,
opposed to somebody with a little bit more insight who might have said, well, we were winning because I was telling them what to do and it happened to be the right thing. And now I'm
uh-huh.
trying to tell them to do what isn't the right thing, and that's why we're losing. So when you get into this bunker mentality of the world is against me and we're losing because I'm being betrayed by everybody, you add that to this. Um, Again, you have to try to think yourself back into the mindset of Germans in the first half of the 20th century. And to do that, you have to take a step back and look at, if you like, German cultural history in the 19th century, the rise of the Romantic movement and the post-Romantic movement, and coinciding with the rise of nationalism, and all these concepts of social Darwinism, where you apply the theories of Darwinism of survival of the fittest, not just to a struggle between species, but to a struggle between societies. So
Oh boy.
just as, lions will compete with each other to see who's the bigger and stronger lion, so nations will compete with each other to
Oh
see who's the
no.
biggest and strongest nation. And Germany has we have almost a God-given right to be the preeminent nation. As you come towards the end of the war, Hitler has made no secret of his conflict with the East, with the Soviet Union, is a zero-sum conflict. There is no room in the world for Nazism and Bolshevism. Only
Yeah.
one can survive. So by the end of the war, he's even saying, if Germany loses, it is because it deserves to lose, and the Soviets have proved to be stronger. And he would rather that Germany goes down to complete destruction than seeks some accommodation with its enemies.
You think of the Allies as being the people that come in and, save the day. It seems like, because it was looking the Red Army coming into Poland and seeing the ghettos and things like that. It seems like there was we all have the same basic idea, but Stalin is also wrong.
This is one of these awkward occasions where the enemy of my enemy
Mhm.
is not necessarily my friend, but I kind of need him in order to defeat my enemy. And I think that it's an interesting thing when you look at the great conferences, at Tehran and Yalta. There's a lot of evidence that Roosevelt was firstly convinced that Stalin was a man he could do business with,
Oh boy.
whereas Churchill, being Churchill, were you probably okay, if I'm being kind, I would say Churchill was astute enough to realize that actually Stalin was every bit as bad as Hitler.
Uh-huh,
If I
uh-huh.
was being less kind, I would say Churchill was actually so Machiavellian he would use anybody in order to achieve his own ends. Or okay, we'll leave
I'll
that
go
to
with that one. That's
yeah.
what I think.
Okay. I've got into big fights over this, as you can imagine. So we'll just park that one for a moment. But
Okay.
Roosevelt was convinced that Stalin could be reasoned with, and that in the end, if he could get Stalin to embrace his vision of the United Nations as the new world order after the war, it was worth making sacrifices to accommodate Stalin in the shorter term, because the longer term gain would be so great. And it was really, by the time you get to Yalta, I think even a lot of Roosevelt's close aides are realizing just how badly the United States is playing its hand,
Uh-huh, uh-huh,
and how much Stalin has the whip hand.
uh-huh.
Um, but yeah, Stalin was not exactly the person you would choose to have as your ally, but Churchill said at the beginning of the war when the Soviet Union entered the war, he said, "In the end, I would welcome the devil as an ally, so long as he was prepared to
Wow.
take up arms against Hitler, because
Wow.
beating Hitler was the thing."
Was that part of, why the Lend-Lease program with the US was happening?
Yeah, the Lend-Lease program it's a fascinating thing, because from the very start, Stalin was saying, "I really need you guys to attack from the West, because
Okay.
I'm losing hundreds of
Mhm.
thousands of troops here." And the Allies repeatedly said, "We're not ready yet." And he kept saying, "But come on, you just got to do something. You got to attack." And
Yeah.
it takes until 1944 for the Allies to be ready for Normandy and to carry that out.
Uh-huh.
Um, there was a widespread belief in many circles in the Soviet Union that the Allies were deliberately dragging their feet, that they wanted the
Well,
Germans and the Soviets to bleed each other white,
uh-huh.
and then they would come and pick up the pieces afterwards. Um, at the Tehran conference, Kliment Voroshilov, who was one of Stalin's sidekicks, horrified the British and Americans by saying at one point, "I don't understand the difficulty. You've got to cross the English Channel to get into France, right? Well, the Red Army crosses enormous rivers pretty much every month. This is just like a big river, isn't it? I mean, what can be so difficult about this?" And he had absolutely no grasp of just the sheer scale and complexity of what he was asking. At one point, when Churchill had turned down an invasion in 1943, saying, "If we invade and it goes wrong, we will lose 130,000 men for nothing." To which Stalin's response was, "I lose 130,000 men in every operation I
I was
man."
going to say, who cares?
Yeah. So his attitude was, what point are you trying to make here? And particularly I think in the United States, but actually also in Britain, it's very easy for people to lose sight of just how important the Soviet Union was in winning the war against Germany. So when we get to D-Day and the British and Americans and Canadians land in Normandy, Germany was giving maximum priority to defeating the invasion in the West. So whatever could be spared was being kept in France in preparation for the invasion. Crush the invasion on the coast and we can still win the war. That meant leaving the bare minimum in the East to hold off the Red Army while this was done. That bare minimum amounted to over 70% of Germany's military strength.
They were also bringing in like boys and elderly people, right? So they
Yeah,
had
because they just run out of men.
right.
But my point is that the fighting in Normandy after D-Day was appallingly heavy. There were heavy casualties by the British and American and Canadian troops. Imagine how much worse it would have been if 70% of Germany's military was not tied up on the Eastern Front. And
Right.
people sometimes forget that just by having to fight the Soviet Union, Germany had more than one hand tied behind its back in the West. And, without, however abhorrent an ally Stalin might have been, he was kind of essential for the defeat of Germany.
I also was interested in the phrase clean Weimar. I don't know how you say it.
The Wehrmacht, yes.
Wehrmacht.
Yes.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. After the war, the history of that, there is another one of the great cliches of history is that victory is always written by the victors. The English language history of the Eastern Front is one of those very unusual wars where, particularly for English speakers, the history was largely written by the losers. Because by the time accounts of the Eastern Front began to emerge, the Soviet Union was a new enemy of the Cold War. For actually very good reasons, Soviet historical accounts were not trusted. They were far too embellished. So the memoirs written by German officers and German soldiers were accepted at face value without any question. Which caused difficulties for the people writing them, because pretty much every unit that fought on the Eastern Front was involved in war crimes. Now, a large number of senior officers ended up working for the US Army Historical Division, helping write histories of some of these battles, because you can imagine it was in the interest of the US Army in the late 40s, early 50s to look at how mechanized battles had been fought against the Soviets, because who knows, they might have had to fight one in Germany, so they wanted that information.
These were former SS?
Mixture of SS and regular army.
Okay.
So they started writing accounts and they wrote their own memoirs, and they deliberately played down the atrocities. First of all, many of them said, "Oh, well, I didn't know about any of these atrocities. I didn't know this stuff was happening," or if it was happening, it was the SS. It wasn't the regular army. Or you'd get SS officers who would say things like, "What you have to remember is that the SS was not a homogeneous organization.
Sure.
There was the Waffen-SS, who were the combat elements, and then there were the Allgemeine SS, who ran the concentration camps, and it was all down to the Allgemeine SS. The Waffen-SS, we were just elite troops fighting against Bolshevism." It's rubbish. They were all knee-deep in it. They all knew full well what was happening. And the memoirs of these people are utterly unreliable. Manstein, for example, this great operational genius, he wrote in his memoirs about how he had refused to pass on on orders about, severity on the Eastern Front and about executing commissars when they were captured. When he was writing his memoirs, he had recently been released from prison, having served a sentence for war crimes, and in his court case, copies of those orders bearing his signature had been produced. So this was just a straight-out lie.
Oh my God.
But this legend of the clean Wehrmacht, they were, to quote one of the SS officers, Soldaten wie andere aus, soldiers like any others, this legend still lives on today. There
Oh
are
my
still
God.
plenty of people who still say, "Oh, but they were just patriots fighting for their country." They may well have been patriots fighting for their country. Most of them were either involved in war crimes or knew full well what was going on.
Yeah, I think that about the United States today. But it is interesting. What was the motivation? Was it like there was pay involved in the military, or the way that they're giving bonuses to ICE agents now?
I think, again, you have to think of the context. So, for example, looking at North America from a British perspective, I am struck by the enormous power exerted by certain parts of the media, whether it's X or whether it's Fox News or other agencies like that. I'm also struck by how many of the other parts of the media have been intimidated into silence.
Yeah.
Now try to think yourself into 1930s Germany or the Soviet Union. There's no internet. All of the press is tightly controlled. All the radio stations are tightly controlled. You've grown up in a different world where, even if you think of 1930s America, where, racism, anti-Semitism were much more widespread and commonplace, and actually so commonplace as to be unremarkable. And then imagine that in a society where all media is so very tightly controlled. It's very easy to persuade people that our way of life, our people are inherently superior. And, you see this in the way that in many countries, populist politicians are demonizing others, whether those others are defined in terms of religion or skin color or sexuality or whatever, that as soon as you start separating people into us and them, it becomes relatively easy then to attach value judgments. They are not us because they are inferior. And once you start regarding other people as inferior to yourself, all sorts of things that previously would have been unthinkable start to become justifiable. So this is, if you like, it's a gradual process of, you can call it indoctrination if you like, but it's a gradual process of conditioning people to regard people outside our tribe as being inferior, as being something that we can exploit, or we need to fear them because they will overthrow us and destroy us, therefore we must destroy them first. And it even gets to the stage where some of the SS who were brought to trial, Otto Ullendorf, who was commander of the Einsatzgruppe that operated in southern Ukraine, tried to defend the killing of Jewish children in Ukraine on the grounds that, but if we didn't kill them, they were going to grow up into adult Jews who would then have had revenge upon my children.
Oh my God.
And
Oh my God.
And I'm sorry to say, you hear very similar language coming out from some factions within Israel to justify what's being done to the Palestinians.
I know.
It's just appalling that, I can sit here in my lounge in Scotland and you're sitting in California and we can have this conversation and we can both be horrified by this. But we also can look around our respective countries and we can see this sort of mindset at large out there.
Oh, yeah.
On a scale that we would love to think is unimaginable. It can't be that big, but actually, yeah, it's out there.
My final question is, I never thought of the refugee crisis after World War II having Germans as part of it as well, because you always think of it
Yes.
as other people leaving. What happened to those refugees?
several million Germans were involved. So the entire province of East Prussia is, nowadays it's divided between Poland and Russia. There is a little enclave of Russia on the Baltic coast around the city of Kaliningrad that used to be Königsberg. So East Prussia is a territory of, I'm trying to think here, of probably one of the New England states, that sort of size.
Okay.
That was entirely ethnically cleansed. The entire German population was expelled. They ended up mainly in West Germany because East Germany by then was under communist control, and they were not going to accept them. Germans from what is now Western Poland were expelled and sent west, again from parts of what became what is now the Czech Republic. And also there were large numbers of German settlers in parts of Hungary and Romania, going right back to the 12th century, 11th century originally, and yet these were all expelled. All of these people were uprooted and expelled. And if ever you find yourself traveling around the Carpathian Mountains of Romania and Hungary, you will come across towns which look so German. These square church towers, these tiled roofs, and you think, my goodness, I could be in Saxony. Well, yeah, these were Saxon settlers. So all of these people were expelled. They ended up losing everything. Many of the women suffered appalling violence at the hands of the new authorities. Many of the men were bundled off to prison camps in the Soviet Union and used as labor right up to 1955. And eventually, most of these people ended up in West Germany, where many of the cities had, if you like, associations, I guess you would think of it. So you'd have a city which had an association with one of the lost cities of the East, where people from that city would sort of meet up and reminisce on, you remember going down Kaiser Wilhelmstrasse or whatever the place might have been or whatever. So these people were expelled. They were, again, it's always the little people who suffer, isn't it? It's not the leaders. They either get away or they end their own lives or whatever, but a remarkable number of them just disappear and live comfortable, obscure lives. But it's the ordinary folk who end up paying the price of their crimes and their errors.
Well, thanks for the uplifting episode. No, it's good. This has been like so great and eye-opening, and I've learned so much. And where can people find you and keep track of your books and things like that?
I have a website, pritbuttar.com, which it has my books on it. It also has my other passion, which is photography of wildlife and the stars. So please feel free to have a look at those and enjoy the nice pictures. My books are available on Amazon and elsewhere. I'd rather you look them up on Amazon and then go and buy them from one of your local bookstores. Don't buy them from the big monsters. It may cost you just a few dollars more, but it'll be to people who actually matter rather than a great corporation that's not going to pay any damn tax. So do the right thing, people. Shop locally.
Shop locally, use your library. I always say that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think my audience needed this context, so I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, Gabe. It's been great fun.
1,000 Natural Shocks, a Bad with Money podcast, is a production of Noted Bisexual, produced by Melisa D. Monts and Diamond MPrint Productions, and music by Zach Sherwin as sung by Sam Barbera. Thank you. Love you. Bye.